The ancient Grecians were passionately fond of festivals and games. In every particular state, such institutions were occasionally celebrated for the amusement of the people, but these were far less interesting than the 4 public games frequented by multitudes from all the districts of Greece. The Pythian games were celebrated at Delphi, the Isthmian of Corinth, the Nemean at Nemea in Argolis, and the Olympic at Olympia near Elis. We propose to give a brief account of the Olympic Games only, as being by far the most splendid, and in which victory was reputed to be the most honourable. The celebrity of these games was extended for many centuries after the extinction of Greek freedom, and their final abolition did not occur until after they had flourished for more than 1100 years. The games were held in summer when the heat was excessive, and to add to the difficulty and fatigue experienced, the more violent exercises were performed in the afternoon, when even the spectators were scarcely able to remain exposed to the sun. To prevent the competition of such as were unskilful, the candidates were required to swear that for 10 months before the commencement of the games they had made it their constant study to prepare for the contest, and during the last 30 days they were obliged to reside at Elis, and had to practice daily under the inspection of the judges. Hence, the permission to contend at the Olympia was regarded as no inconsiderable honour, and served in some degree as a consolation of the vanquished. Immediately before the commencement of the different exercises, a herald led every candidate separately through the assembly, and demanded if anyone knew him to be a man of profligate character, or to have been guilty of any notorious crime. As members were present from every state in Greece, to some of whom each of the combatants was known, it was rarely happened that any suspicious character chose to expose himself to such scrutiny. The candidates were required to make a solemn declaration that they would not endeavour to gain the victory by bribing their adversaries, or by a violation of the laws regulating the different contests, and any person guilty of a breach of this promise was not merely deprived of the olive crown, but was fined by the judges and could never attend at the games. These regulations seem to have accomplished the purpose for which they were intended, since, during several hundred years, only 5 instances occurred in which any improper artifice was known to be employed by the competitors in the games. Dacles the Mycenaean was the first who had the honour of being crowned with the simple wreath woven from the sacred olive tree near Olympia for his victory in the stadium. The Greeks held the exercise of wrestling in high estimation, which, in point of antiquity, stood next to the foot race. The object of the wrestler was to throw his adversary to the ground, but it was not till this had been thrice repeated that he obtained the victory. Like all who contended in the games, the wrestlers were accustomed to rub their bodies with oil, partly to check the excessive perspiration occasioned by the heat and the violence of the exercises, and partly from an opinion that oil gave the limbs a greater degree of pliancy and agility. As the smoothness occasioned by the oil would have prevented the combatants from grasping each other with firmness, it was customary for them, after being anointed, to roll themselves in the dust of the stadium, or to be sprinkled with a fine sand kept for that purpose at Olympia. If in failing, one of the wrestlers dragged his adversary along with him, the combat was continued on the ground, till one of the parties had forced the other to yield the victory. The inhabitants of Hydestan and the countries constituting the ancient kingdom of Syria had undergone a variety of revolutions, but inactivity has always formed the leading feature in their character. In every age they have fallen as easy prey to invaders, nor have the repeated instances of oppression to which they have been exposed ever roused them to limit the exorbitant power of their sovereigns. The Greeks, living in a climate nearly as sultry as that of Asia, would probably have fallen victim to the same indolence, had not their early legislators perceived the danger and employed the most judicious efforts to avert it. Among the means devised to accomplish this end, none seem to have been so effectual as the public games. It was not by any occasional effort that a victory could be gained at Olympia. Success could be attained only to those who were endured to hardship, who had been accustomed to practice the athletic exercises while exposed to the scorching heat of the sun, and who had abstained from every pleasure which had a tendency to debilitate the constitution and lessen the power of exertion. Greek Athletics, Sports and Festivals by E. Norman Gardiner, 1910. Wrestling is perhaps the oldest and most universal of all sports. The wall paintings of Beni Hassan show that almost every hold or throw known to modern wrestlers was known to the Egyptians 2,500 years before our era. The popularity of wrestling among the Greeks is proved by the constant metaphors from this sport and by the frequency with which scenes from the wrestling ring appear not only in athletic literature and art, but also in mythological subjects. Despite the changes in Greek athletics caused by professionalism, which affected wrestling and boxing more than many other sports, the popularity of wrestling remained unabated. On early black-figured vases, Hercules is constantly represented employing the regular holds of the palastra, not only against the giant Antaeus, but against monsters such as Achelous of Triton, or even against the Nemean lion, and centuries later, the language in which Ovid and Lucan describe these combats is in every detail borrowed from the same source. Still more is this the case with the wrestling match between Chersion and Theseus, which occurs so often on the red-figured vases of Athens. On coins, wrestling type survived into imperial times. The fight with the Nemean lion is represented on the 4th century gold coins of Syracuse, and that with Antaeus on imperial coins of Alexandria. These fights are one of the many forms under which Greek imagination loved to picture the triumph of civilization and science over barbarism and brute force. To the Greeks, wrestling was a science and an art form. Theseus, the reputed discoverer of scientific wrestling, is said to have learnt its rules from Athena herself. The greatest importance was attached to grace and skill. It was not sufficient to throw an opponent, it had to be done correctly and in good style. Hence, even when athletics had become corrupted by professionalism, wrestling remained for the most part free from that brutality which has so often brought discredit on one of the noblest of the sports. Pausanias records the case of a certain Sicilian wrestler, Leontiscus, who defeated his opponents by trying to break their fingers. But such tactics did not commend themselves to the Greeks, although it does not seem that they were formally prohibited, and Pausanias expressed his disapproval by the comment that he did not understand how to throw his opponents. The very name palastra sufficiently indicates the early importance of wrestling in Greek education, an importance which is maintained even during the Empire. The method of instruction was strictly progressive. There were separate rules for men and boys. The different movements, grips, and throws were taught as separate figures. The simpler movements first, then the more complicated. In learning them, the pupils were grouped in pairs, and more than one pair could be taught at a time. In the early stages, a beginner would be paired with a more advanced pupil, who would help him. Later on, the movements were combined, and practice was allowed in free play. The Paedo tribes seem to have enforced this instruction with a free use of the rod. A pair of Paedo tribi are engaged in instructing a pair of youthful wrestlers. One of the latter has seized his opponent around the waist and prepares to give them the heave. The other has allowed him to obtain his grip and stands with outstretched hands waiting for the Paedo tribes to give him his next order. There were doubtless numerous textbooks of drill in wrestling and other sport for use of the Paedo tribi. A fragment of such a textbook has been found on papyrus of the 2nd century. It contains orders for executing a number of different grips and throws, and each section ends with the order, complete the grip, or throw him. The sections dealing with these throws are hopelessly mutilated, but considerable portions of 4 sections dealing with the grips remain. Unfortunately, the brevity of the commands, characteristics of all the drill books at the time, makes them extremely difficult to understand accurately, and the interpretation is too technical to deal with in this section. Competitions in wrestling, boxing, and the pancration were conducted in the same way as a modern tournament. Lucian's description of the manner of drawing lots has already been quoted. In the case of an odd number of competitors, one of them drew a bye. This, of course, gave him a considerable advantage in the next round over a less fortunate rival, who had perhaps been exhausted by his previous contest. Thus the crown many times had been dependent on the luck of the lot. It is to such an accident that Pindar refers at the close of the 6th Nemean Ode, when he says that Alcibiades and his brother were deprived of 2 Olympic crowns by the fall of the lot. So it is mentioned as an additional distinction for an athlete to have won a crown without drawing a bye, and Pausanias speaks with some contempt of some as have here now won the olive by the unreasonableness of the lot, and not by their own strength. There is, of course, no ground for the idea that one who had drawn a bye in the first round remained a bye till the final. To draw a bye in a single round is quite sufficient advantage. An archaeologist should really credit the Greeks with a certain amount of practical common sense. The number of competitors varied. Lucian, in the passage referred to, speaks of 5 or 12 competitors, and this statement agrees generally with the other evidence. Pindar's heroes, the Agonetan wrestlers, Alcimedod and Aristomenes, were each victorious over 4 rivals, that is, in 4 rounds. The same number is mentioned in the Olympic inscriptions on the wrestler Exonocles and the boxer Philippus. 4 rounds imply 9 to 60 competitors. A long epigram of Ariston, who won the Pancration in 207, tells us that there were 7 competitors and that he took part in all 3 rounds and did not owe his crown to the luck of the lot. Sometimes a famous athlete was allowed to walk over, in which case he was said to have won without dust. That is, without having even dusted his body with the fine sand which athletes use before this sort of exercise. Such a victory is recorded of Milo at some unknown festival when he was the only competitor in wrestling. The first victory of this sort recorded at Olympia is that of Dromius in the Pancration. An inscription found at Olympia, emulating the victories of Diagoras at Rhodes, records that Dorius won a victory in boxing at the Pythia. These instances, which could be multiplied, are sufficient to prove that Philostratus is mistaken when he asserts that no crown was awarded at Olympia without competition. The case of Dorius disproves a similar statement made by Heliodorus with regard to Pythia. There could hardly have been a necessity for such a rule in early times, but a rule requiring more than one competitor may well have been introduced at the time of the athletic revival under the Empire. If not at the Olympia or Pythia, at some of the many festivals which bore their names. A rule to this effect might be reasonably expected at festivals where valuable prizes were offered. Greek Athletics, Sports and Festivals by E. Norman Gardiner, 1910. The Greeks distinguished 2 styles of wrestling. One which they called upright wrestling or wrestling proper, in which the object was to throw an opponent to the ground. The other, ground wrestling, in which the struggle was continued on the ground till one or other of the combatants acknowledged defeat. The former was the only wrestling admitted in the pentathlon and in wrestling competitions proper. The latter did not exist as a separate competition, but only as part of the Pancration, in which hitting and kicking were also allowed. In the practice of the palestra, ground wrestling, as well as wrestling proper, was freely indulged in. We gather from Lucian that separate places were assigned to the 2 exercises. Ground wrestling took place in some places under cover, and the ground was watered until it became muddy. The mud rendered the body slippery and difficult to hold, and so rendered accidents less likely, while wallowing in the mud was supposed to have a most beneficial effect on the skin. Wrestling proper took place on the sandy ground in the centre of the palestra. This was called the scammer, the same word that is used for the jumping pit. It denotes a place dug up, levelled and sanded so as to form a smooth, soft surface. For actual competitions, a scammer must have been provided somewhere in the stadium, probably where such existed in the semicircular theatre at the end. In heroic times, boxers and wrestlers wore a loincloth, such as is occasionally depicted on black-figured vases, but this loincloth seems to have been usually disregarded, even in the 6th century. Wrestlers, especially boys, sometimes wore ear caps, but there is no evidence of their use in the competitions. For obvious reasons, they have always worn short hair. Professional athletes under the Empire wore the little hair that was left uncut, tied up in an unsightly little top knot called a cirrus. In the present chapter, we are concerned only with wrestling proper. Before discussing its rules, let me utter an emphatic protest against the slanderous fallacy implied in the use of the term Greco-Roman to describe a style in wrestling in vogue in some of the music halls at the present day. There is nothing in Greek wrestling proper or in the pancration which bears any resemblance to, or can offer any justification for, this most useless and absurd of all systems, which, as Mr. Walter Armstrong remarks, might have been invented for the express purpose of bringing a grand and useful exercise into disrepute. We have no definitive statement as to the rules of Greek wrestling at the time, and are forced to infer them from the somewhat fragmentary evidence of literature and art. The two essential points which distinguish one style of wrestling from another are the definition of a fair throw and the nature of the hold allowed. In most modern styles, a man is considered thrown only when both shoulders, or one shoulder and one hip, touch the ground at the same time. In the Cumberland and Westmoreland style, he is thrown if he touches the ground with any portion of his body, or even with his knee. A throw may be either a clean throw, or the result of a struggle on the ground. With the Greeks, it is practically undisputed that only clean throws counted. If one or both wrestlers fell to the ground, the bout was finished. Further, it is certain that a fall on the back, on the shoulders, or the hip counted as a fair throw. An epigram of one Domostratus is conclusive evidence from the back. Another epigram relates to how Milo, advancing to receive his crown after a dustless victory, slipped and fell on his hip, whereupon the people cried out not to crown a man who had fallen without an adversary. The question of a fall on the knee is more difficult. The passages quoted from Asclepius are doubtful and capable of being interpreted either way. So is the epigram of Milo, ascribed on Simonides, which states that he won 7 victories at Pisa without even falling on his knee. The evidence of this monument is divided. We have a group of bronzes, apparently copies of some well-known Hellenistic original, which represent a wrestler who has fallen on one knee. His victorious opponent stands over him with one hand pressing down his neck, with the other forcing back his arms. There can be no doubt that he is in a position to throw him on his back if necessary, but he seems to make no effort to do so. On the other hand, we have a group of vases and wall paintings representing the throw known as the Flying Mare, in which the wrestler, as he throws his opponent over his head, sinks to one knee. Various explanations are possible, the most plausible being that the scenes really belong to the pancration. None of them is quite convincing. Where the evidence is so evenly balanced, certainty is impossible. On the whole, I am inclined to abandon the view which I formerly held, and to accept Gunther's view that the fall on the knee did not count. What happened if both wrestlers fell together? The only evidence for this is the wrestling match at the Iliad, described in our second chapter. There it will be remembered that in the first bout, Odysseus fell on top of Ajax. In the second, they both fell sideways, after which Achilles declared the contest drawn. From this we inferred that if both wrestlers fell together, no fall was counted. The accounts of wrestling in later writers are merely literary imitations of Homer and of little independent value. One fall did not decide the victory. 3 falls were necessary. There are numerous allusions in literature to the 3 throws. The technical word for winning a victory in wrestling was the treble, and then the victor was called. At first sight it seems uncertain whether the reference is to 3 bouts or 3 falls, but the latter interpretation is the only one which suits every passage, and is rendered certain by the categorical statement of Seneca that a wrestler thrice thrown lost the prize. So much for the actual throw and the number of throws necessary for victory. we pass on to the question of the means employed by the Greek wrestler to throw his opponent. In particular, was tripping allowed, and were leg holds allowed? In the artificial Greco style of today, tripping is forbidden, and no holds are allowed below the waist. Tripping is seldom represented in the arts, but the frequent references to it in literature from the time of Homer to that of Lucian leave no doubt that it played an important part in Greek wrestling, as it has in every other rational system in every other age. The evidence for leg holds is less definitive, but it seems certain that in practice, at least, the Greeks made little use of them. This is the natural inference from the passage in the Laws where Plato contrasts the method of the pancration, in which leg holds and kicking played a conspicuous part, with the methods of upright wrestling. The latter is the only form of wrestling which are as useful in his ideas states, and he defines it as consisting the disentangling of neck and hands and sides, a masterly definition showing a true understanding of wrestling. For the wrestler's art is shown more perhaps in his ability to escape from or break a grip than his skill in fixing one. The vases show that the omission of leg holds in Plato's definition is no accident. In the pancration, one competitor is frequently represented in the act of seizing another's foot in order to throw him. Antaeus and Cercyon, whose methods Plato in the above passage strongly condemns, are commonly depicted as grabbing at the feet of Hercules and Theseus, but in wrestling proper, through arm, neck, and body holds occurring constantly, we never see a leg hold. It is probable that this is the result not so much of a direct prohibition as of the practical riskiness of such a hold under the conditions of upright wrestling. A wrestler who stoops low enough to catch an opponent's foot is certain to be thrown himself if he misses his grip. On the other hand, there is no practical objection when once the wrestlers are engaged to catching hold of an opponent's thigh, whether for offence or defence. Indeed, one of the commands of the papyrus implies that it was lawful to take a grip between an opponent's legs or around the thighs. In wrestling, groups which represent the heave, we sometimes see a wrestler trying to save himself by seizing the other's legs. Perhaps we may recognise as a wrestling scene a group which occurs on an Etruscan tomb. One man has lifted another onto his shoulder, with his right arm clasped right around his right around his right thigh, and his left hand holding his right hand. He may intend to throw him, or he may merely be carrying him. Further, we must remember that upright wrestling formed part of the pancration, and such groups may therefore belong to the pancration. The conditions of Greek wrestling may be summed up as follows. Number 1. If a wrestler fell on any body part, hip, back or shoulder, it was a fair fall. Number 2. If both wrestlers fell together, then nothing was counted. Number 3. 3 falls were necessary to secure a victory. Number 4. Tripping was allowed. And number 5. Leg holds, if not actually prohibited, were very rarely used. The positions of the Greek wrestler, the grips and the throws which he employed, are known to us from numerous monuments. In view of the number of the monuments and their complexity of the subject, it is impossible within the limits of this work to treat them exhaustively, and I must confine myself to the most important and most interesting of the types represented. The attitude adopted by the Greek wrestler before taking hold was very similar to that of the modern wrestler, taking a firm stand with his feet somewhat apart and knees slightly bent, rounding his back and shoulders, his neck advanced but pressed down into his shoulder blades, his waist drawn in. He tried to avoid giving any opening himself, while his outstretched hands were ready to seize any opportunity offered by his opponent. This position is frequently represented in art, but no better illustration of it can be found than the Naples wrestling boys. Generally, the wrestlers stand square to one another and prepare to take hold somewhat in the style of Westmoreland and Cumberland wrestlers. Like gable rafters of a house, or butting against one another like rams, or even resting their heads on each other's shoulders. This position is frequently depicted on the vases. Needless to say, this type does not represent a preliminary butting match, as a certain foreign archaeologist seems to imagine it. It is the natural position of two wrestlers engaging. Sometimes their heads do crash together as they meet. I read recently an account of a wrestling match in which the heads of the two wrestlers met with a noise which could be heard throughout the whole house. Sometimes instead of taking hold from the front, the wrestlers try to obtain a hold from the side, as in preparing for the heave, and in such a case the bodies are turned sideways to one another. A not very satisfactory illustration of such a position is shown on a British Museum Kylix, representing Theseus and Chereson, with which we may compare the group of Hercules and Antaeus on the frieze of the theatre Delphi, where the sideways position is more clearly marked. Theseus and Heracles seem in both cases to have avoided the ponderous rush of their foes by stepping aside. In endeavouring to obtain a hold, wrestlers frequently seize one another by the wrist. This action is often a purely defensive movement to prevent an opponent from obtaining a hold on their neck or body. Sometimes, as on a Munich amphora, each wrestler holds the other by the wrist. Sometimes, one wrestler holds both his opponent's wrists. Such holds are merely momentary and are of little importance. A more effective hold was obtained by seizing an opponent's arm with both hands, one hand seizing the wrist, the other gripping him at the elbow or under the armpit. This seems to have been a very favourite hold and led to one very effective fall of which we have very many illustrations. It is the throw known in modern wrestling as the flying mare, and is probably what Lucian describes. Having seized his opponent's arm in this manner, described the wrestler rapidly turning his back on him, drawing his arms over his shoulder, using it as a lever by which to throw him clean over his head. At the same time he stoops forward, sometimes sinking on one or both knees. The beginning of the throw is seen on an Etruscan wall painting. One wrestler has swung his opponent off of his feet and hoisted him over his shoulder. His right hand still grasps his left wrist, and his left hand has been transferred to his neck, and he leans forward in order to complete the throw. A somewhat later moment occurs on a British Museum Kylix. The drawing is rough and careless, and the stoop of the legs is probably exaggerated, because otherwise the group would be too high from the vase space. Two wonderfully lifelike pictures of this throw occur on a Kylix in the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. On the interior, we can see the victor kneeling to one side. He has let go with his right hand, and his opponent, left unsupported, is about to fall on his back. The exterior, which is unfortunately much mutilated, shows the same fall a moment later. The falling wrestler tries to save himself by placing his right hand on the ground. This throw was undoubtedly common to a wrestling proper and to the pancration. A black-figured amphora in the British Museum represents Heracles employing it against the Nemean lion. Returning to the arm hold which leads to this throw, we find several methods of meeting is represented. On the amphiorus vase, Peleus has seized with both hands the left arm of Hippolymus. The latter, with his free right hand, grips Peleus under his right armpit, and thus weakens his grip and prevents him from turning around. A similar defence is shown on the black-figured amphora in the British Museum, where the attack is made on the right arm. A Berlin amphora shows another style of counter. The wrestler to the left grasps his opponent's left wrist, but the latter, by a quick move forward, has rendered useless the right hand which should have grasped under his arm, and passing his own right hand behind his back, grasps his right arm just above the elbow. In all these cases, the object is to prevent the opponent turning round or to lose his grip. The latter object is noticeable on the coins of Asfendus, where the left-hand wrestler grasps with both hands his opponent's left, while the latter, with his opponent's right hand, grasps his right wrist or left upper arm. We may remark on how some of the coins, the right-hand wrestler hand hangs down helplessly, as if rendered powerless by this grip. Greek wrestling was governed, it would seem, more by a tradition of good form than by actual rules. Thus, Though it was not regarded as good form to seize an opponent's fingers and break them, Leontiscus, he did. Such practices do not appear to have been actually prohibited. They were well enough in the pancration, where the object was to force an opponent by any means to acknowledge defeat, but they could hardly be regarded as legitimate means by throwing an opponent, which was the object of true wrestling. The neck is an obvious and effective place by which to obtain a hold, and strength of neck is essential to any wrestler. Pindar, in the 7th Nemean Ode, speaks of the wrestler's strength and neck invincible. Describing the training of the Spartans, he says that they exercised alike arms, legs, and neck. In the Knights of Demos, he advises the sausage seller to grease his neck in order to escape from Cleon's grip. Neck holds were freely used in the pancration, but rather for the purpose of choking an opponent rather than throwing them. Several varieties of neck holds are exhibited on the vases. On a red figure crater in the Ashmolean, one wrestler seizes the other's wrist with his left hand, his neck with the right. The wrestler so attached defends himself by seizing the other the left armpit with his left hand. An interesting feature of this vase is the figure of Winged Victory seated upon a pillar watching the contest. A different defence is shown on the back-figured amphora in the British Museum. Here, the left-hand wrestler grasps with his left hand his opponent's right, which is seizing his neck. We may notice that he grasps it at one of the weakest point just below the elbow, yet another means of defence is to seize the opponent's neck here. In no sport is there a greater variety of styles and rules than in wrestling. Almost every country has a style of its own. In Greece, festivals helped to preserve uniformity of the rules, but there was still room for much diversity of style. The Sicilians in particular had a style of their own, the rules for which had been drawn up by one, or a Cadmus. There was also a Thessalian chip, but in what the Sicilians or Thessalians excelled we do not know. The Argives, who are especially famed for their skills in wrestling, are described by Theocritus as cross buttocks. On the other hand, the Spartans disdained the science of wrestling and the teaching of trainers, and relied on mere strength and endurance. Plutarch ascribes to the victory of the Thebans at Leuctra to their superiority over the Spartans in wrestling. Individuals too had their favourable chips. Greek Athletics, Sports and Festivals by E. Norman Gardiner, 1910.